Back at Saint Benedict's, furthermore, I saw that my words had evidently had some effect on the boy, for in the weeks that followed, he continued on his struggling uphill course. He passed 2 more quizzes, receiving an A- on one of them. For his midterm project, he produced an adequate papier-mâché rendering of Hadrian's Gate, and in class he was less disruptive to the group of do-nothings among whom he sat, if indeed he was not in fact attentive. Such, of course, are the honeyed morsels of a teacher's existence, those students who come under one's own direction from the darkness to the light, and I admit that I might have taken a special interest that term in Sedgewick Bell. If I gave him the benefit of the doubt on his quizzes when he straddled 2 grades, if I began to call on him in class only for those questions I had reason to believe he could answer, then I was merely trying to encourage the nascent curiosity of a boy who, to all appearances, was struggling gamely from beneath the formidable umbra of his father. The fall term was by then drawing to a close, and the boys had begun the frenzy of preliminary quizzes for the annual Mr. Julius Caesar competition. Here again, I suppose I was in my own way rooting for Sedgewick. Mr. Julius Caesar is a Saint Benedict's tradition, held in reverence among the boys, the kind of mythic ritual that is the currency of a school like ours. It is a contest held in 2 phases. The first is a narrowing maneuver, by means of a 12 written quizzes, from which 3 boys from the first form emerge victorious. The second is a public tournament, in which these 3 take the stage before the assembled student body and answer questions about ancient Rome until one alone emerges triumphant, as had Caesar himself from among Crassus and Pompey. Parents and graduates fill out the audience. In front of Mr. Woodbridge's office, a plaque attests to the Mr. Julius Caesars of the previous half-century, a list that begins with John F. Dulles in 1901. And although the ritual might seem quaint to those who have not attended St. Benedict's, I can only say that in a school like ours, one cannot overstate the importance of a public joust. That year, I had 3 obvious contenders. Fred Masudi, who, as I intimated, is a somewhat gifted boy, Martin Blythe, a studious type, and Deepak Mehta, the son of a Bombay mathematician, who was dreadfully quiet, but clearly my best student. It was Deepak, in fact, who on his own and entirely separate from the class had studied the disparate peoples, from the Carthaginians to the Egyptians, whom the Romans had conquered. By the end of the narrowing quizzes, however, a surprising configuration had emerged. Sedgewick Bell had pulled himself to within a few points of 3rd place in my class. This was when I made my first mistake. Although I should certainly have known better, I was impressed enough by his efforts that I broke one of the cardinal rules of teaching. I gave him an A on a quiz on which he had earned only a B, and in so doing, I leapfrogged him over Martin Blythe. On the 15th of March, when the 3 finalists took their seats on stage in front of the assembled population of the school, Sedgewick Bell was among them, and his father was among the audience. The 3 boys had donned their togas for the event, and were arranged around the dais, on which a pewter platter held the green silk garland that, at the end of the morning, I would place upon the brow of the winner. As the interrogator, I stood front row center, next to Mr. Woodbridge. "Which language was spoken by the Sabines?" "Oscan," answered Fred Masudi without hesitation. "Who composed the second triumvirate?" "Mark Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, sir," answered Deepak Mehta. "Who was routed at Philippi?" Sedgewick Bell's eyes showed no recognition. He lowered his head in his hands, as though pushing himself to the limit of his intellect, and in the front row my heart dropped. Several boys in the audience began to twitter. Sedgewick's leg began to shake inside his toga. When he looked up again, I felt that it was I who had put him in this untenable position. I who had brought a tender bud too soon into the heat, and I wondered if he would ever forgive me. But then, without warning, he smiled slightly, folded his hands, and said, "Brutus and Cassius." "Good," I said instinctively. Then I gathered my poise. "Who deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Empire?" "Odoacer," Fred Masudi answered, then added, "in 476 A.D." Who introduced the professional army to Rome?
Gaius Marius, sir, answered Deepak Mehta, then himself added, in 104 BC.
When I asked Sedgewick his next question, who was the leading Carthaginian general of the Second Punic War, I felt some unease, because the boys in the audience seemed to sense that I was favoring him with an easier examination. Nonetheless, his head sank into his hands, and he appeared once again to be straining the limits of his memory before he looked up and produced the obvious answer. Hannibal. I was delighted. Not only was he proving my gamble worthwhile, but he was showing the twittering boys in the audience that, under fire, discipline produces accurate thought. By now they had quieted, and I had the sudden, heartening premonition that Sedgwick Bell was going to surprise us after all, that his tortoise-like deliberation would win him by morning's end the garland of laurel. The next several rounds of questions proceeded much in the same manner as had the previous two. Deepak Mehta and Fred Masudi answered without hesitation, and Sedgwick Bell did so only after a tedious and deliberate period of thought. What I realized, in fact, was that his style made for excellent theater. The parents, I could see, were impressed, and Mr. Woodbridge next to me, no doubt thinking about the next annual fund drive, was smiling broadly. After a second form boy had brought a glass of water to each of the contestants, I moved on to the next level of questions. These had been chosen for their difficulty, and on the first round, Fred Masudi fell out, not knowing the names of Augustus's children. He left the stage and moved back among his dim-witted pals in the audience. By the rule of clockwise progression, the same question then went to Deepak Mehta, who answered it correctly, followed by the next one, which concerned King Jugurtha of Numidia. Then, because I had no choice, I had to ask Sedgwick Bell something difficult. Which general had the support of the aristocrats in the Civil War of 88 BC? To the side, I could see several parents pursing their lips and furrowing their brows, but Sedgwick Bell appeared to not even notice the greater difficulty of the query. Again he dropped his head into his hands. By now the audience expected his period of deliberation, and they sat quietly. One could hear the hum of the ventilation system and the dripping of the icicles outside. Sedgwick Bell cast his eyes downward, and it was at this moment that I realized he was cheating. I had come to this job straight from my degree at Carleton College at the age of 21, having missed enlistment due to myopia, and carrying with me the hope that I could give to my boys the more important vision that my classical studies had given to me. I knew that they responded best to challenge. I knew that a teacher who coddled them at that age would only hold them back, would keep them in the bosoms of their mothers so long that they would remain weak-minded through preparatory school and inevitably then through college. The best of my own teachers had been tyrants. I well remembered this. Yet, at that moment, I felt an inexplicable pity for the boy. Was it simply the humiliation we had both suffered at the hands of his father? I peered through my glasses at the stage and knew at once he had attached the outline of ancient Roman history to the inside of his toga. I don't know how long I stood there, between the school assembled behind me and the two boys seated in front. But after a period of internal deliberation, during which time I could hear the rising murmurs of the audience, I decided that in the long run, it was best for Sedgwick Bell to be caught. Oh, how the battle is lost for want of a horse! I leaned to Mr. Woodbridge next to me and whispered, I believe Sedgwick Bell is cheating. Ignore it, he whispered back. What? Of course, I have great respect for what Mr. Woodbridge did for Saint Benedict's in the years he was among us. A headmaster's world is a far more complex one than a teacher's, and it is historically inopportune to blame a life gone afoul on a single incident in childhood. However, I myself would have stood up for our principles had Mr. Woodbridge not at that point said, Ignore it, Hundert, or look for another job. Naturally, my headmaster's words startled me for a moment. But being familiar with the necessities of a boys' school, and having recently entertained my first thoughts about one day becoming a headmaster myself, I simply nodded when Sedgewick Bell produced the correct answer. Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Then I went on to the next question, which concerned Scipio Africanus Major. Deepak Mehta answered it correctly, and I turned once again to Sedgewick Bell. In a position of moral leadership, of course, compromise begets only more compromise. And although I know this now from my own experience, at the time I did so only from my study of history. Perhaps that is why I again found an untenable compassion muddying my thoughts. What kind of desperation would lead a boy to cheat on a public stage? His father and mother were well back in the crowded theater, but when I glanced behind me, my eye went instantly to them, as though they were indeed my own parents out from Kansas City. Who were the first emperors to reign over the divided empire? I asked Sedgewick Bell. When one knows the magician's trick, the only wonder is in its obviousness. And as Sedgewick Bell lowered his head this time, I clearly saw the nervous flutter of his gaze directed into the toga. Indeed, I imagined him scanning the entire outline, from Augustus to Jovian, pasted inside the twill, before coming to the answer, which, pretending to ponder, he then spoke aloud. Valentinian the First and Valens. Suddenly, Senator Bell called out, That's my boy! The crowd thundered, and I had the sudden, indefensible urge to steer the contest in young Sedgewick Bell's direction. In a few moments, however, from within the subsiding din, I heard the thin, accented voice of a woman speaking Deepak Mehta's name. And it was the presence of his mother, I suppose, that finally brought me to my senses. Deepak answered the next question about Diocletian correctly, and then I turned to Sedgewick Bell and asked him, Who was Hamilcar Barca? Of course, it was only Deepak who knew that this answer was not in the outline, because Hamilcar Barca was a Phoenician general eventually routed by the Romans. It was only Deepak, as I have noted, who had bothered to study the conquered peoples. He briefly widened his eyes at me, in recognition, in gratitude, in disapproval, while beside him, Sedgewick Bell again lowered his head into his hands. After a long pause, Sedgewick asked me to repeat the question. I did so, and after another long pause, he scratched his head. Finally, he said, Geez. The boys in the audience laughed, but I turned and silenced them. Then I put the same question to Deepak Mehta, who answered it correctly, of course, and then received a round of applause which was polite, but not sustained. It was only as I mounted the stage to present Deepak with the garland of laurel, however, that I glanced at Mr. Woodbridge and realized that he, too, had wanted me to steer the contest toward Sedgewick Bell. At the same moment, I saw Senator Bell making his way toward the rear door of the hall. Young Sedgewick stood limply to the side of me, and I believe I had my first inkling then of the mighty forces that would twist the life of that boy. I could only imagine his thoughts as he stood there on stage, while his mother, struggling to catch up with the senator, vanished through the fire door at the back. By the next morning, our calligraphers would add Deepak Mehta's name to the plaque outside Mr. Woodbridge's office, and young Sedgewick Bell would begin his lifelong pursuit of missed glory. Yet, perhaps because of the disappointment I could see in Mr. Woodbridge's eyes, it somehow seemed that I was the one who had failed the boy, and as soon as the auditorium was empty, I left for his room. There I found him seated on the bed, still in his toga, gazing out the small window to the lacrosse fields. I could see the sheets of my outline pressed against the inside of his garment. "Well, young man," I said, knocking on the door frame, "that certainly was an interesting performance." He turned around from the window and looked at me coldly. What he did next, I have thought about many times over the years, the labyrinthine wiliness of it, and I can only attribute the precociousness of his maneuvering to the bitter education he must have received at home. As I stood before him in the doorway, Sedgewick Bell reached inside his cloak and one at a time lifted out the pages of my outline. I stepped inside and closed the door. Every teacher knows a score of boys who do their best to be expelled. This is a cliché in a school like ours. But as soon as I closed the door to his room and he acknowledged the act with a feline smile, I knew that this was not Sedgewick Bell's intention at all. "I knew you saw," he said.
"Yes, you are correct."
"How come you didn't say anything, Mr. Hundred?"
"It's a complicated matter, Sedgewick."
"It's because my pop was there."
"It had nothing to do with your father."
"Sure, Mr. Hundred." Frankly, I was at my wits' end, first from what Mr. Woodbridge had said to me in the theater, and now from the audacity of the boy's accusation. I myself went to the window then and let my eyes wander over the campus so that they would not have to engage the dark, accusatory gaze of Sedgewick Bell. What transpires in an act of omission like the one I had committed? I did not blame Mr. Woodbridge, of course, any more than a soldier can blame his captain. What had happened was that instead of enforcing my own code of morals, I had allowed Sedgewick Bell to sweep me summarily into his. I did not know at the time what an act of corruption I had committed, although what is especially chilling to me is that I believe that Sedgewick Bell, even at the age of 13, did. He knew also, of course, that I would not pursue the matter. Although I spent the ensuing several days contemplating a disciplinary action. Each time I summoned my resolve to submit the boy's name to the honor committee, however, my conviction waned. For at these times I seemed to myself to be nothing more than one criminal turning in another. I fought this battle constantly, in my simple rooms, at the long chipped table I governed in the dining hall, and at the dusty chalkboard before my classes. I felt like an exhausted swimmer trying to climb a slippery wall out of the sea. Furthermore, I was alone in my predicament, for among a boarding school faculty, which is as perilous as a medieval court, one does not publicly discuss a boy's misdeeds. This is true even if the boy is not the son of a senator. In fact, the only teacher I decided to trust with my situation was Charles Ellerby, our new Latin instructor and a kindred lover of antiquity. I had liked Charles Ellerby as soon as we had met, because he was a moralist of no uncertain terms. And indeed, when I confided in him about Sedgewick Bell's behavior and Mr. Woodbridge's response, he suggested that it was my duty to circumvent our headmaster and speak directly to the boy's father. Of course, this made sense to me, even if I knew it would be difficult to do. I decided to speak to Senator Bell again. Less than a week after I had begun to marshal my resolve, however, the senator himself called me. He proffered a few moments of small talk, asked again after the gun he had given me, and then said gruffly, "Young man, my son tells me that the Hannibal Barca question was not on the list he had to know." Now, indeed, I was shocked. Even from Sedgewick Bell, I had not expected this audacity. "How deeply the viper is a viper," I said, before I could help myself. "Excuse me?" "The Phoenician general was Hamilcar Barca, sir, not Hannibal." The senator paused. "My son tells me you asked him a question that was not on the list, which the Oriental fellow knew the answer to in advance. He feels you've been unfair, is all." "It's a complex situation, sir," I said. I marshaled my will again by imagining what Charles Ellerby would do in the situation. However, no sooner had I resolved to confront the senator than it became perfectly clear to me that I lacked the character to do so. I believe this had long been clear to Sedgewick Bell. "I'm sure it is complex," Senator Bell said. "But I assure you there are situations more complex. Now, I'm not asking you to correct anything this time, you understand. My son has told me a great deal about you, Mr. Hundert. If I were you, I'd remember that." "Yes, sir," I said, although by then I realized he had hung up. And thus young Sedgewick Bell and I began an uneasy compact that lasted out his days at Saint Benedict's. He was a dismal student from that day forward, scratching at the very bottom of a class that was itself a far cry from the glorious yesteryear classes of John Dulles and Henry Stimson. His quizzes were abominations, and his essays were pathetic digestions of those of the boys sitting next to him. He chatted amiably in study hall, smoked cigarettes in the third form linen room, and when called upon in class could be counted on to blink and stutter as if called upon from sleep. But perhaps the glory days of Saint Benedict's had already begun their wane, for even then, well before the large problems that beset us, no action was taken against the boy. For Charles Ellerby and me, he became a symbol, evidence of the first tendrils of moral rot that seemed to be twining among the posts and timbers of our school. Although we told nobody else of his secret, the boy's dim-witted recalcitrance soon succeeded in alienating all but the other students. His second and third form years passed as ingloriously as his first, and by the outset of his last with us, he had grown to mythic infamy among the faculty members who had known the school in its days of glory. He had grown physically larger as well, and now, when I chanced upon him on the campus, he held his ground against my disapproving stare with a dark one of his own. To complicate matters, he had cultivated, despite his boorish character, an impressive popularity among his schoolmates, and it was only through the subtle intervention of several of his teachers that he had failed on 2 occasions to win the presidency of the student body. His stride had become a strut. His favor among the other boys, of course, had its origin in the strength of his physical features, in the precocious evil of his manner, and in the bellowing timbre of his voice. But unfortunately, such crudities are all the more impressive to a group of boys living out of sight of their parents. That is not to say that the faculty of Saint Benedict's had given up hope for Sedgewick Bell. Indeed, a teacher's career is punctuated with difficult students like him, and despite the odds, one could not help but root for his eventual rehabilitation. As did all the other teachers, I held out hope for Sedgewick Bell. In his fits of depravity and intellectual feebleness, I continued to look for glimpses of discipline and progress. By his 4th form year, however, when I had become the dean of seniors, it was clear that Sedgewick Bell would not change. At least, not while he was at St. Benedict's. Despite his powerful station, he had not even managed to gain admission to the state university. It was with a sense of failure, then, finally, that I handed him his diploma in the spring of 1949, on an erected stage at the north end of the great field, on which he came forward, met my disapproving gaze with his own flat one, and trundled off to sit among his friends.